Okay, guys, we are going to do chapter 14, which is environmental law. If you're in management 209, it should be about midway through your packet. We're going to do a two-page thing on environmental laws to know. If you're in the green packet for 211, it is like the second page after the answer, all the questions at the beginning of the packet. So look for a two-page thing, front and back, on environmental laws to know. These two pages we are going to do first before we do anything in the study guide. In fact, let me tell you a little story about this chapter from way back. Originally, when Swin made the textbook, amongst other authors, he left out basically environmental law. And you had to download it from his website to get the pages that were important. Well, half the class would never do that. And so they'd only get like 5 or 6 pages in the book, and that's all they'd read. And then when the test came, they were screwed because they didn't have any of the other information. Well, not one single question came from those first 5 pages in the books. Everything came from the downloaded material. Now, that downloaded material was told to them every semester for about 3-4 semesters, and the average on the answers or the grades for chapter 14 were abominable. And so one semester he was sick or had a family emergency or something like that, and was unable to do chapter 14, and had basically a study guide sheet made up and sent to all the students, picked it up in class, and it had a bunch of terms and everything to know, and everybody was like, where is this stuff? He's like, did you not read the downloaded material that you're supposed to download? And it started getting more and more frequent then later on. That study guide sheet is basically these 2 pages of environmental laws to know, the 2 pages. I put together a big synopsis of those 2 pages, and this accounts for about 95% of the chapter 14 material, along with, in conjunction with, the 2 charts that we're going to make that are also in your packet. In your packet, towards the very end of the packet, should be a chart. If you're in 209, it has 3 charts, one of which has been X'd out. If you're in 211, all 3 charts are on the very back page of your green packet. The 3rd chart is from chapters 15 and 16, so you'll need that, but 209 doesn't have those chapters. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go through those 2 pages in the environmental laws to know. We're going to go over them. We're also going to fill in those 2 sheets, those 2 charts at the very end of your packet. Those 2 charts are probably going to be about 70% roughly of the exam from chapter 14, just chapter 14. Questions will come from those 2 charts, along with the 2 pages here as well. We'll have an additional 20-25%, and they all go hand in hand, don't get me wrong. But this will equate for most of the questions from chapter 14. All right, let me get the packet real quick, and we'll get started with the material. All right, under the environmental laws to know, we are going to fill in a couple of little itty-bitty details that we need to do. Then after we're done doing these 2 pages, and I'm basically reading along with you, but I am filling it in as we go. After we've done these 2 pages, we'll go back into the study guide and find little blurbs in the study guide that hopefully I've already talked about, and we'll just preface them where they are in the study guide. If I don't do them, we'll add to it, because the little blurbs are the rest of the chapter 14 material. So the 2 charts, these 2 pages, and the little blurbs will account for probably everything in the study guide for chapter 14 that you'll have on your exam. Now, normally chapter 14 is about 50% of exam 4. It'll probably be a little less with chapter 12 being added this semester, but it should be about 30, 35, 40% of the test. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing is the Clean Air Act, passed in 1963. Its main purpose is to focus on air pollution between the states and give states federal assistance. It's been amended 3 times. So started passed in 1963, 70, 77, and 1990. It was also amended. It gives 2 levels of protection. These are the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, NAAQS. These NAAQS are the primary and secondary levels of protection. Now, this NAAQS acronyms are big on chapter 14, big time on chapter 14. If you're in 209, chapter 13 has a lot of acronyms as well. But NAAQS are the primary levels of protection. Primary is for human beings. Secondary is vegetation, climate, economic values, which basically encompasses our environment itself. So we're going to look at standards. EPA sets the standards, the states enforce. If not, the federal government will do it themselves. And an excellent question in the back of your study guide for just that material right there is number 16 in the back of your study guide. And we'll go over the back of the study guide a little bit later. But the EPA sets the federal standards for environmental protection. The states are put into control regions. Okay, the states are put into air quality control regions, or AQCRs, another acronym, AQCRs. Okay, and each state will implement their own plan on how they're going to do with federal administrative agency, EPA, and administrative agencies' rules and regulations. So each state is put into an AQCR. Okay, and each state that is in each AQCR will set up their own implementation plan, or SIP, State Implementation Plan. Those that are not going to follow through with what the federal government will do, the federal government will come in and enforce themselves. And if they have to, they'll be considered to be a non-attainment area. Now, these are all terms that are not necessary, that you might want to add to that Clean Air Act. Non-attainment areas, NAAQS, which we'll do later on in the packet anyway. But and then SIP and AQCRs, all of those go with the Clean Air Act. So if he says, which of the following acronyms does not go with the Clean Air Act, note that NAAQS, AQCRs, and SIP, State Implementation Plans, all or three of them that definitely go with the Clean Air Act. Okay? It worries about toxic air pollutants such as asbestos. You can have mercury, benzene, radionuclides. Radionuclides is only in the book. In the study guide, you have a little later on, you have mercury, benzene, and asbestos. These are considered to be toxic air pollutants. We'll talk about that with control technologies a bit later. And it also deals with indoor air pollution. In terms of indoor air pollution, you got to worry that sometimes the indoor air pollution can be 100 times more polluted than actually outdoor air pollution. And one of the keys that they worry about in indoor air pollution is radon gas. These are little blurbs found in the study guide that you can add to it. So the things that you might need to add to that first little paragraph on Clean Air Act is the NAAQS, or the 2 levels of protection. The AQCRs is each state is put into a region. They have their own SIP, State Implementation Plan. They worry about toxic air pollutants, asbestos, mercury, benzene, radionuclides are 4 of them that you need to know. I just wrote down asbestos. You can add in mercury, benzene, radionuclides. And then also it deals with indoor air pollution and radon gas being a big one there. We'll go through the study guide and find all these little terms on the pages of the study guide after we go through this thing. The National Industrial Recovery Act, when he gave the study guide, that study sheet for everybody to do, I kept looking and looking and looking, and I couldn't find it. This is the precursor to the Fair Labor Standards Act that was found unconstitutional. We talked about it a little bit in the Chapter 12 video, National Industrial Recovery Act. Also, we talked a little bit about Chapter 6. It is not, even though it sounds like it is not an environmental law, so you can X that out. In fact, I'm probably going to redo this page a little bit later, better during this quarantine time period. All right, the next thing we have is a Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act is basically a blanket umbrella of all the different water acts we have. Now, it's its own act, but all the other water acts fall under its jurisdiction. And it regulates water pollution. Certain things it's going to be concerned with are point sources of pollution. A point source of pollution is where pollution is entering into navigable waterways. Wherever the point is that pollution is entering into navigable waterways. Now, however that gets into the navigable waterways, whether it be from a building or whatever, the point that it comes in is a point source of pollution. It also is going to forbid thermal pollution. Thermal pollution is the discharge of heated materials into those navigable waterways, causing a decrease in the oxygen content, which causes fish to die and stuff like that. It also is going to protect wetlands. Wetlands are basically swamps, marshlands, bogs that are saturated by surface water that allow vegetation and animals and fish and stuff like that to do it. The Army Corps of Engineers is going to be dealing with the primary responsibility for dealing and protecting wetlands, not allowing them to be drug up without a permit and stuff like Other things under the Clean Water Act, it authorizes the government to clean up oil spills within 12 miles of the U.S. shoreline. This was as a result of the Oil Pollution Act, which we'll talk about a bit later on. Oil Pollution Act is the only one that's not on this two-page sheet because it was added into the newest study guide, the previous study guide is the newest. This one's just typed a little bit better. All right, so the Clean Water Act, a blanket umbrella of all the major acts, including River and Harbor, Federal Water Pollution Control Act, Water Quality Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, all fall under the blanket umbrella of the Clean Water Act. The main three things it deals with: point sources of pollution, thermal pollution, and protecting the wetlands, swamps, land marshes, and bogs, and the Army Corps of Engineers is pretty much in charge of that. It also clean up oil spills within 12 miles of the U.S. shoreline. I would note that falling under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, but more importantly for the Oil Pollution Act, which will have its own in-depth question a bit later on, which we'll go through the study guide and have to say why one question is no longer correct if he didn't change it this past semester. All right, the next act is River and Harbor. Now, when we come to some of these acts, all you really need to know for the most part is, what did this act deal with? What was its major contribution? Did it do something at the very beginning or whatever? What is its major contribution, or what area of the environment does it protect the most? Now, there's also fines for certain acts and control technologies for certain acts. That's going to be on our own chart that we're about to do in a little while, okay? The River and Harbor is the first Water Pollution Act in 1886. I don't think you know the year, but 1886. It established a permit system for discharge of refuse and waste into navigable waterways, including lakes, streams, stuff like that. It is regulated by the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System that was created in 1972. So this permit system that was created by the River and Harbor Act is now under the jurisdiction of the NPDES, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, but it was originally, this permit system was under River and Harbor. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about permit systems. A permit system is basically a legal license to pollute. You're given tradable permits, which each permit gives you a unit amount of pollution. Now, that means the optimal amount of pollution in the United States or navigable waterways or anything, whatever we're talking about, is not going to be zero. We know that there's going to be pollution occur, but we want to try to keep it to a level that is understandable or okay with the EPA. How do they do that? They create a permit system. And say there's 5 different companies, and each of them are given 200 permits. These 5 companies get 200 permits, so we have a legal license to pollute 1,000 units of pollution. If this is all the EPA is giving this industry to do, then if they go over that 1,000, or if they each go over their 200, they can be fined depending on what the fine, jail time sentence is for each violation. So if they go over their amount that they are given to legally pollute, their legal license to pollute with these tradable permits, they're going to have to pay a fine. So here we go. We have Company A, Company B, Company C, Company D, Company E. They're all given 200 or sold 200 permits from the federal government on tradable legal license to pollute. Now, say Company A becomes very efficient, i.e. much less pollutant than any of their companies. And they're only using about 175 of the units rather than 200. And Company B is not being efficient, and they're going over by 225. Well, here's by 25 by going over to 225. So now what we have is one company being very efficient and only doing 175 units, but then we have Company B doing 225 units, or 25 units over, being much more pollutant, i.e. less efficient. And if all the other companies are doing the same 200 units, we're still at 1,000 units, but one, Company B, is being fined for 25 units over their allotted amount. Well, what A can do is, A can continue to be less pollutant and then sell their tradable permits to Company B. So now if they're doing it at a 175 clip, they can trade 25 units to Company B. Company B now still pollutes 225, but they don't get fined for it anymore because they bought those permits from Company A. It doesn't add to the total amount of units of being pollution. We're still at 1,000, but now they don't get fined if they go over their allotted 200 because they bought other tradable permits from someone else who's being less polluted. Now, the pros and cons are in the study guide. Also, these tradable permits, we'll talk about that briefly. That's probably the one thing from the first 4 or 5 pages of the study guide that has been on the exam on at least a semi-consistent basis. There's one other one that's been on the test, but not as consistent. The next thing you need to know, this all came about from the River and Harbor Act. The National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System is in charge. Now, environmental social groups like the Sierra Club or Greenpeace or something like that will also buy up some of these tradable permits from, say, Company A, and then basically retire them and don't let anybody have them. So now if anybody goes over, they now made it, say they bought 10 of Company A's 25 units. They retire those. Now we only have 990 units of pollution available because the other 10 have been retired. Now, if someone else goes over, like B instead, then they're going to have to pay their fine. But maybe they can lower the amount of pollution with these Greenpeace, the Sierra Club, and stuff like that. All right. The next one we have is Ocean Dumping Act. And if you want, put a big arrow all the way down from Ocean Dumping Act to the second to the bottom where it says Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act. The Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act and the Ocean Dumping Act are the same thing. One is its formal name, Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act at the very bottom. The one at the top, Ocean Dumping Act, is its informal name. Now, we talked about in Chapter 8, the formal and informal names of those 4 major acts. I said how important they are. This one is also important for this exam. So no, Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act is the same thing as the Ocean Dumping Act. Now, if you look at the, let's go down to the Marine Protection real quick, then we'll come back to the Ocean Dumping Act. The Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act protects oceans from being polluted, requires a permit that we talked about in this tradable permit system earlier to dump waste into the ocean. So, does the Marine Protection Research Sanctuaries Act, or Ocean Dumping Act, whether you want to use formal or informal name, does it allow for pollution by cruise ships to dump waste into the ocean? Yes, it does, as long as it doesn't violate its tradable permit or the permit exceeds it. If it exceeds it, which it often does, it's often violated by cruise ships. They exceed their amount. That would be a violation. But does it allow for ocean dumping? Yes. So the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, or the Ocean Dumping Act, does allow for ocean dumping to occur. It is often violated more than they're allowed under their permit by cruise liners, but it does allow it. So note that if you get a question where it says does not allow, which one does not allow for ocean dumping, and it gives you the Ocean Dumping Act, that's too easy. That's not going to be the correct answer anyway, because it does allow it just at a permit level. It's often violated by cruise ships at sea, establishes marine sanctuaries at sea as well. If he does say the marine sanctuaries, he's probably not going to give you the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act. He'll probably give you the informal name of the Ocean Dumping Act, just because it makes it a little bit more difficult. If you say which one gives you the marine sanctuaries, protects marine sanctuaries at sea, the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act seems like the logical answer, so it's probably not going to be on there. Ocean dumping. Now, if you go up to the Ocean Dumping Act, you have the fines and jail times. Now, in your packet, on the very last page, you have 2 charts for Chapter 14. One is a fine and jail time chart, and the other one is a control technology chart. We are going to do the fine and jail time chart first. Now, the first act is the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act. You can either write that in fully, or you can go ahead and just put in acronym form if you want to give yourself a little more room. But the first act on that first chart, where we're talking about fines and jail times. So on that back sheet of your packet, there is a act, the area, and a fines and jail time column. That chart that we're going to do right there is going to answer probably 5, 6, maybe even more questions from just Chapter 14 alone. So the first act that we're putting on our list is the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act. What is the area that it deals with? Ocean dumping in the water, okay? Whatever they're dumping into the ocean. If you want to put in parentheses under area ocean dumping, because that's its informal name, so now you have a formal and informal name there, it works out pretty good. But then the biggest thing for the test purposes is going to be the fine and jail time associated to it, okay? You're given a civil penalty of not more than $50,000, 50K, and or up to a year in prison. Okay? $50,000 fine and or 1 year in prison. Now, the other things that can be added to the fines and jail times, which are 50K and or 1 year, and we always need to focus on and or. And or means a B and C, but not A and B, but not C. So if a cruise ship violates the Ocean Dumping Act or Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, it's going to be a $50,000 fine and or a year in jail. Okay? You can also get an injunction to stop them from dumping the waste into the ocean, or you can revoke or suspend their permit that they got for that ocean dumping. So the ability, the remedies that the EPA would have is $50,000 fine and or 1 year in jail, an injunction, an equitable remedy to stop them from doing it before causing irreparable harm to the environment, and or revoke, suspend their permit that they were granted to under the Ocean Dumping Act, Marine Protection Research Sanctuaries Act. So under your first chart, you should have $50,000 and or 1 year, revoke suspension of a permit, and then possible injunction are all options there. We're going to mainly focus on the fines and jail times, but you need to know that one as well. All right. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, it authorizes the EPA to make national standards for drinking water. It deals with landfills and underground as well. Does not allow for dumping of a well used for drinking water. And they're going to use best available control technology. Best available control technology, or BACT, when we're dealing with the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974. The next one is the Toxic Substances Control Act. Do not get this confused with the toxic air pollutants, which is another thing that we're going to have a little bit later on. The Toxic Substances Control Act deals primarily with chemicals, manufacturing of the chemicals, processes to test those chemicals and manufacture them, and how the EPA is going to check and see how their effect on the humans and the environment is going to be. So those primary and secondary sources under NAAQS, primary and secondary levels of effect on humans and the environment. But the main thing about Toxic Substances Control Act is going to be chemicals. And the EPA can either flat out test them before they go on sale, limit, or even stop manufacturing for certain chemicals, depending on how they affect not only the environment, but human beings as well. Now, the next act is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. This is the next one we need to have on your fine and jail time chart. So if you want to look at the fine and jail time chart, once again, we're going to fill this in also. On the fine and jail time chart, you have a criminal fine and a civil fine. The civil fine is $25K. The criminal fine is $50K. Now, when we go back through the study guide and look at the little blurbs, only one's put into the study guide. That's the more important one for tests. But civil fine is $25, criminal is $50,000 per day per violation. Per day per violation, $25,000 fine per day per violation, and imprisonment up to 2 years. So for your fines and jail times for Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, you can put 25 civil, 50 criminal per day per violation, and or 2 years in prison. And this fine can be doubled for repeat offenders, and that is one that you need to know. Which act allows a fine to be doubled for repeat offenders? And then you just need to know it. It's going to be the RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA being the acronym. It deals with new hazardous waste spilling into the environment. So for your chart, you need to have below the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, the next line should have the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, if you want to do acronyms. The area is new hazardous waste spilling into the environment. And then on the fine and jail time, you should have 25 civil, 50 criminal per day per violation, and or up to 2 years. And or up to 2 years. And this is the only one that does a double for repeat offenders. Okay, double for repeat offenders. Okay, In terms of the new hazardous waste, it's going to have the EPA is going to regulate facilities, but states have responsibility under the EPA. The EPA can enforce, so it's kind of like the Clean Air Act. They enforce underground storage facilities under Resource Conservation Recovery Act where new hazardous waste is spilling into the environment. Make sure you know new hazardous waste and not old hazardous waste, because old hazardous waste spilling into the environment is under CERCLA, a different act. Okay, the next one is the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. This is the selection for permanent waste for disposal of nuclear waste at permanent sites. Any state doesn't mind or doesn't have a problem being a temporary storage of nuclear waste, but no state wants to be the permanent site for nuclear waste. Until that time, everything's going to be stored in temporary sites, but no state wants the permanent site to be within their state boundaries. Under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the EPA, in conjunction with the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, are going to be in charge of this. One thing that they are in charge of, and is a little blurb in the study guide that we'll go back to the study guide and look at, is the uranium mines and mills when it comes to that. And also thermal pollution when it comes to nuclear waste comes into there as well. Okay, the next one is the Noise Control Act. Noise control is also going to be on your fine and jail time chart, so it'll be right after a Resource Conservation Recovery Act. It establishes, the EPA can establish emission standards so that no harmful noise pollution can occur. The penalty is not more than $50,000 per day, imprisonment up to 2 years. So for the fine for noise control, the Noise Control Act, the area is going to be noise pollution. The fine or jail time is $50K per day and or up to 2 years in prison. And or up to 2 years. Everything's going to be up to, because you can always have a minimum sentence, but the maximum sentence would be up to 2 years. Once again, whenever you get the and or, it is imperative that you know that for the fines and jail time questions you may have. Line A may say the fine amount, line B or line C may say the jail time amount. Make sure you have those correct. And then if one's wrong and one's right, then only the one that's right is correct. If both of them are correct, then you got to look for B and C, but not A and B, but not C type thing. Okay, so the Noise Control Act. It also uses best available control technology, wherever you want to put that in there. It uses best available control technology as well. We're going to skip over endangered species because we're going to talk about that. There's a little bit more in the study guide, the recent study guide, along with oil pollution that's been added. So we're going to talk about that when we go through the little blurbs in the study guide itself. The next two, Water Quality Act and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, there's not much major stuff there. Just understand that falls under the blanket umbrella of the Clean Water Act and part of the collective laws of water pollution. There's no major thing. There's no fine, jail times that are put into there as well. Now, we've already done Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act when we did ocean dumping earlier. So now we're on the last act of this page, and that is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, also known as FIRPA, okay? FIFRA, okay? Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, and you will probably have that acronym. It will be the next one on your fine and jail time. Under the act, you want to put FIFRA, Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, okay? You're going to put that under the act, and then the area is going to be pesticides, okay? In the fine and jail time column or row, you're going to put person. So in that fourth row, you're going to have FIRPA, pesticides, and person. Because there's going to be 3 individual stages under FIRPA that you need to note for test purposes, okay? All right, FIRPA gave the federal government the power over pesticides and other related chemicals used in pesticides. So that's pesticides and chemicals. So chemicals will be under the Toxic Substances Control Act and also FIRPA if you're given one of those, and you need to make sure you know that for both. The main one that deals with chemicals is Toxic Substances Control Act. That would be your best answer if only one's available, but pesticides and chemicals for FIRPA. All right, pesticides must be registered with the EPA. If they are dangerous, the EPA can suspend registration. They can inspect plants where pesticides are made. Then we have the rest of the fines and jail times. Now, the next the 3 rows that you have under FIRPA are going to be the areas. So After pesticide, the registrant or producer, that is all on one line, registrant/producer, will have a $50,000 fine and or 1 year. The registrant and producer would have a $50,000 fine and or 1 year. On the next row, under the area, I would put commercial dealer. For the commercial dealer, the fine and jail time, next row over, is $25,000 fine and or 1 year. So if he gives you a storyline and Frank is a registrant or producer of the pesticide, the fine is up to $50,000 and or 1 year in jail. If Frank is the commercial dealer, i.e. Form B, is up to $25,000 fine and or 1 year in jail. Okay? Now there's other users of pesticides. And I would put in parentheses farmers because the storyline he usually gives is farmer. Farmer would be another user or other user. This would be the third row of all the FERPA. So FERPA is going to use up 4 rows. You have just FERPA with the pesticides and person. Then you're going to have the type of persons, three rows of the types of persons. You don't have anything under the first act portion of it. But under other, also known as farmers, is up to $1,000 fine and or 30 days in jail. So other users, farmers, in parentheses, I would put $1,000 fine and or 30 days in jail. Okay? And the semicolons are a little bit off on the little environmental law to know page at the very bottom. That chart would be correct. So once again, registered producer is $50,000 and or 1 year. Commercial dealer is $25,000 and or 1 year. Other users, i.e. farmers, is $1,000 fine and or 30 days in jail. All right. You should have 1 row left on your fines and jail time chart. We will do that when we go through the little blurbs in the study guide with oil pollution. Okay? All right. The last one, the act is on the next page over. The last one is the Comprehensive Environment Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. This is also known as a Superfund. The Superfund was created by Congress to clean up old hazardous waste. So now we have the difference between new hazardous waste, which is the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and the CERCLA, Comprehensive Environment Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, also known as a Superfund. The Superfund cleans up old hazardous waste where it's spilling into the environment. It identifies hazardous areas and ranks them in terms of severity. This ranking is the national priority list. You might want to add that to the sheet under CERCLA. The rank area severity is the national priority list. So that goes with the CERCLA Act. And that would probably be also another one that's going to be acronym based. Okay? It also says basically under this CERCLA Act that old hazardous waste spilling in the environment, pretty much anybody is going to be held responsible for that old hazardous waste that is currently spilling in the environment. Who created the waste? They're responsible. What business transported that waste to where it is now? Who is the owner of that, the land in which the waste is on now? Who were owners of that land previously that knew about that waste being on the land? Who owns the land currently, okay, while the waste is now spilling into the environment? All of those people are going to be held responsible. The person making the waste, transporting the waste, the owner of the land at the time that the waste was disposed of, any owners after that that knew of the waste and did nothing about it, and the current owner who owns it, that the waste is now spilling into the environment on their actual land. All of those people are going to be held responsible, and this can be held under for tort liability as well. Okay? All right, so under CERCLA, known as a Superfund, clean up old hazardous waste spilling into the environment, identify the hazardous areas and rank them in terms of severity. This is the national priority list. Then the Superfund gives money to clean up those sites. Who could be responsible? Pretty much anyone. And that's what you need to be looking for a multiple choice answer. It's one of those all of the above type things. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to go over is the terms to know, which is ending up the rest of this page too. Now, we've already talked about quite a few of these, and we're going to be quickly going over those as well. but then some of them we haven't gone over near as much. We'll also hit them again when we go through the blurbs in the study guide. And then we're also going to fill in the last chart that we have when we do some of these terms. The mobile sources, a mobile source under the Clean Air Act, we're not talking about clean water, Clean Air Act, mobile sources of pollution is basically anything that's a mobile source. Planes, trains, automobiles, motorcycles. The automobile being the primary source of mobile pollution. That's the easiest question on the face of the earth that he has all semester. The primary source of mobile pollution is going to be the automobile, okay? Gas stations are going to be under the Clean Air Act as well, service stations, because of the emission standards associated to this mobile source of pollution. Anything that's not a mobile source of pollution is a stationary source. So mobile sources and stationary sources fall under the Clean Air Act. Those are more terms under the Clean Air Act. A stationary source is a non-movable object, such as a chemical refinery, a manufacturing plant. And if that is causing pollution, air pollution to be developed, not a mobile source, it is a stationary source of pollution that's causing this pollution to exist. All right, the next thing is a permit system. We've already talked about that. It gives a legal license to pollute. We have a known amount of pollution. They can sell their permits to others if they're becoming more efficient. Superfund, we just talked about with CERCLA, that is created by Congress to clean up old hazardous waste spilling in the environment. Acid rain. I would note that these are different types of things that we know: nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, sulfur oxide, carbon monoxide. All of these things are things that you need to know for pollutants that the Clean Air Act has under the jurisdiction, and those four specifically make up acid rain. Now, if he has any of those four on there, the Clean Air Act is the act that we go to. If he puts all four of those on a question in conjunction with one another, you need to know that's under the Clean Air Act as well, but that would make up acid rain. Okay, we talked about AQCRs, air quality control regions. I would note that as an acronym. Those are the ones where the EPA sets standards, the states put into place with their implementation plan, how they're going to do it. The ones that do not meet the standards are a non-attainment area. They can lose highway funds, educational funds, until compliance with the federal standards that they have. So once again, EPA sets standards, the states enforce. If the states don't do it, air quality, but in their air quality control region, they're considered to be a non-attainment area, and the federal government will come in and do it themselves. All right, the next thing you have is 3 columns or 3 things on control technologies. You can, we're going to skip over this on these 3 little things right here because we're going to put into the next chart. Your next chart on that back page of your packet should have the different types of control technologies. And there's only 3 on this list, but now there are 4. Okay, this list was made a long time ago with that study sheet that he gave out to the entire class that I basically added. He's added 1 more since then. All right, so on your column sheet, you have in the back of your packet, I'm just going to go to the back of the packet real quick. And I'm using the Management 211 packet, but it's the same one for 209 as well. But here we go. We have that 4-column chart right after it. Acronym, the name, area, and H2O versus air. All right. This chart is also, those 2 charts, the one that we just filled out with 1 row left to go, and this chart we're about to fill off, is at least 50% of Chapter 14 exam, more than likely, okay? The first one is Best Available Control Technology, or BACT. So in the acronym portion, you want to put BACT. I'm sorry, RACT. RACT. RACT is Reasonable Available Control Technology. And please correct that. The first row should be RACT. Reasonable Available Control Technology. However you want to write it out, you just put reasonable, available, and then control technology, because all 4 are going to be control technology at the end. What is its area? Existing stationary sources of pollution. Existing stationary sources of pollution. Stationary source, chemical refinery, manufacturing plant, an existing building, okay? It is under the Clean Air Act. So in the last column, H2O versus air, we're talking about Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. It's under the Clean Air Act. The next one is Best Available Control Technology, or BACT. So in the next row, BACT is your acronym. Best Available Control Technology under the name. And you'll use those interchangeably. Use the acronym, and then you'll use the full name. So one form may have one exam may have the form with the full name, Best Available Control Technology, and someone next to you may have the exact same question, but it's in the acronym form. Same exact question, Best Available Control Technology. This deals with new stationary sources of pollution. New stationary sources of pollution under the Clean Air Act. So air would be in the last column as well. So you have BACT, Best Available Control Technology, new stationary sources of pollution, and then the Clean Air or Air Act. All right, the next row, skip that acronym, leave it blank, because we're also going to be talking about the best available control technology again. Okay? I would leave the acronym and the name blank. Under BACT in the next row, leave the acronym and the name blank because they're both best available control technology. Now, in the next row, you want to put new point source of pollution. New point sources of pollution. New point sources of pollution. And that would be under the Clean Water Act or H2O, whatever you want to put. Clean Water Act. All right? So your third row of information should have 2 empty spots and then new point sources of pollution, Clean Water Act. All right? In the next row, you should have best practical control technology. Best practical control technology, BPCT. BPCT, best practical control technology. And this is existing point sources of pollution. Existing point sources of pollution. And that would be under the Clean Water Act. So, before we go any further, let's talk about it. So say we have a chemical refinery that is in the smokestacks is billowing out air pollution. That would be under the Clean Air Act. If that same building was putting waste and stuff into navigable waterways, that would be an existing point source of pollution. Okay? And that would be under the Clean Water Act. So the building can do it airwise up in the air and then also into navigable waterways if it's close to a river or a lake or something like that. So note that for the test. Is it the going into the waterways, point sources of pollution, then you have the Clean Water Act, or is it air, because it's air pollution, and we're going to talk about that in a second, okay? The last one is Maximum Achievable Control Technology, MACT, Maximum Achievable Control Technology. And this area deals with toxic air pollutants. Toxic air pollutants. Now remember, those toxic air pollutants, benzene, asbestos, mercury, radionuclides. Radionuclides being the book, not necessarily the study guide as much. But toxic air pollutants would be the area. You want to put those examples like right below it because your chart's done. For the most part, you're in good shape. Those toxic air pollutants fall under the Clean Air Act. So if he gives you a question that says, which of the following control technologies is not utilized under the Clean Air Act? All of them are used under the Clean Air Act except best practical, correct? Because that's the only one with H2O. Best available is used in the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. So which of the following control technologies is used in the Clean Water Act? That would be best practical and best available. Best available control technology is used in Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. Which of the following is not a part of the Clean Water Act? Which of the following control technologies is utilized in the Clean Air Act? So you have all those different questions there, just straightforward, basic questions there. Then the other ones that you have is going to be if he gives you a storyline scenario. All right? Let's do this. Let's say that a building was created in 1995. It is currently causing a billowing of air pollution. What type of control technology would be used when that building was erected in 1990s? Well, yes, it's an existing building, but at the time it was a new building. New stationary sources of pollution would use best available control technology. Best available control technology, when it was first created in 1990, it would use best available control technology because it was a new stationary source of air pollution. Okay, new in basically the 90s. Now, currently, that would be reasonable available control technology. So if you ask you when the existing problem, that'd be reasonable available. When it was first built, best available. Best available is generally going to be much more expensive than reasonable available, just FYI on that. Okay? So that gives you a heads up there. Another way to remember this is best available control technology, whether it's clean water or clean air, is new pollution, new stationary or new point sources of pollution. If it's an existing problem, existing building, existing source of pollution, that is reasonable available control technology if it's under air, or it's best practical control technology if it's an existing point source under the Clean Water Act, water. All right? Now, the one question that gets almost everybody, and I would not be surprised if he puts it on the exam, most everybody misses this that doesn't come to tutoring on the exam. He'll ask a question: which type of control technologies are used by mobile sources of pollution, such as automobiles? Well, do you see an area on your chart there about mobile sources of pollution? I see stationary sources, I see point sources, I don't see mobile sources at all. And unless it's a mercury, benzene, or asbestos thing, radionuclide, then it doesn't fall under there. So mobile sources of pollution don't use a control technology. And so then you're looking for a none of the above answer. Everybody panics and picks one of them, okay? If you're gonna guess, pick best available control technology, but don't do it for mobile sources of pollution. They're not listed there. All right, any questions on that chart? Now, you should have under best available control technology, you should have 2 blank spots. Under best available control technology, the full name, you should have one little column row that you can put in there. I would go ahead and put in parentheses Noise and Safe Drinking Water Act. Because if you put noise and safe drinking water, make it small, parentheses, whatever you want to do. Remember, both of those also use best available control technology, and we did that as a little blurb earlier on. Okay, so fill in noise and safe drinking water will help you. I'll give you a little more. Noise being above in your fine and jail time chart. So our 2 charts for chapter 14, other than one row, should be completely filled. If they are not filled, please email me or text me, and I can maybe send a picture and or fill in the blanks or something like that for you as well. All right. Finishing up the last terminologies from the packet. Okay, we are now at potentially responsible party. That was under circle. That's anybody that had dealt with the land, transported the waste, all that stuff. We talked about that already. We've already talked about wetlands. Those are areas saturated by surface water or groundwater that supports vegetation. Adapted to life, saturated soil conditions include swamps, marshlands, bogs. The Clean Water Act is going to be in charge of this, but the Army Corps of Engineers is where you need to get a permit if you're going to dredge up or do anything with a swamp, marshland, or bog. They are going to be in charge of its jurisdiction under the EPA. The National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, if you want to do an acronym, NPDES, permit system for discharge of waste, and this was created with the Clean Water Act with the tradable permit system. It took over in 1972, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System for permits. Thermal pollution, we already talked about thermal pollution is a key to the Clean Water Act. It is the discharge of heated materials or waters or materials into navigable waterways, decreasing the oxygen content within water due to these. Electric hydrating plants is going to be a big one that we need to know about there. That's a little blurb in the study guide that we're about to go over as well. Boomer Atlantic cement rule. Haven't heard about that being on test in a long time, but that is a case that says the nuisance suit is ineffective for eliminating pollution. Just note that. The NRC, in conjunction with the EPA, is going to deal with construction, opening, and monitoring power plants under the Nuclear Waste Policy Control Act. So note that the EPA and NRC are in charge of that. Uranium mines and mills, once again, discussed. Okay. So we pretty much filled everything in the charts except for oil pollution. Now we're going through the chapter study guide real quick. And I mean, we've already done most of this stuff, but we are now going to hit over key words and phrases. And some of these we've already done before. But here we go. Once again, I talked about those 5 pages early on in a previous edition of the book and study guide that he forgot to put in for semesters. And you had to download that material. Well, none of the material questions were found from the first few pages. Those are basically pages 353, 354, 355, 356, 357, all the way until basically 358. In those pages, the only things I've heard about being on the exam, on page 355, it talks about the advantages and disadvantages in the middle, 2, H and I, advantages and disadvantages of using tradable permit systems. Tradable permit systems in National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, tradable permits under the Clean Water Act, River and Harbor first created it. But the advantages and disadvantages are right there. All right. The early history. Note Teddy Roosevelt was huge into the pro-environment, conservationists and stuff like that. FDR did a lot during the New Deal era well. So you got first Roosevelt with the national park system being created, pro-environment, and then FDR with some of the New Deal things. Okay. The Nixon administration created the National Environmental Policy Act and everything like that. The EPA was created in 1970 by executive order. On page 357 towards the bottom, F, the EPA was created by executive order in 1970 by Nixon. Nixon, through executive order, created the EPA. The EPA is an independent executive. It's really much more independent, but it was created by executive order, so it falls under the executive branch as well. Okay, so it's an independent executive administrative agency. We talked about NASA and EPA being the only ones. You probably didn't even have that on chapter 6, but I would note that Nixon's executive order